I did it. Okay. Welcome, everybody. Thanks again for coming. Our panelists are almost all here. So that's great. And yeah, what I thought we would do is I invited, a range of various cohort scholars to talk about their experience of publishing theory. I think most of us have had the experience that maybe it's a little bit harder to do that or a little less clear. So a number of the graduate students asked me if I could do kind of a panel on this, and so here we are. And if my panelists could just talk for 3-4 minutes about their experience. I know some of you have published theory, have been editors, also been chairs of departments where those things are evaluated, so just speak to your own experiences. And there's no particular order here. Maybe we'll just go in the order of how I see you in my Zoom room. Gil, do you mind going first?
You can hear me?
Yep.
Hey, Rebecca. Nice seeing you. Nice seeing everybody else. Um, I'll keep it very short. So, I guess I'll say, first of all, that I'm on the editorial board of Theory and Social Inquiry, and Monica is here as well. And so our editorial board is represented here. We are Theory and Social Inquiry, so you can hear papers are indeed part of repertoire. I would say, and it's not a model like a pure theory paper, a paper that raises a theoretical question and then parses theories or concepts as the main method of the paper is not our model paper. It doesn't mean that we don't publish those. I think there's several in the works. But in general, we kind of define the goal of the journal, the model paper in a way that is very similar to Theory and Society, that we believe we are the true inheritors of. Uh, you know, uh, we are all the people who were kicked out of the editorial board of Theory and Society. That journal, in my opinion, is going down the drain, but we still have Theory and Social Inquiry. And the model paper in both what Theory and Society used to be and Theory and Social Inquiry today is a paper that is at one and the same time asks an important theoretical question, but addresses it via, no less relevant, no less substantial part of the paper being empirical research. So it's the combination of theory and empirical research that is really kind of like our model paper. We don't want just empirical papers. We don't want just theory papers. We really like the combination. Now, a personal point. Um, I don't think I've ever published a paper that was simply theory, actually. Um, I published quite a few papers in Theory and Society in the past. I had a great experience there. I got like really very useful reviews at the time, but it was never a paper that was pure theory. And um, I in general, I find that trying to write a paper and publish a paper that is pure theory rather than theory as it is sort of demonstrated in the body of empirical material. Just pure theory is a lot harder. It's not an exercise I would recommend to the faint of heart. In general, I much prefer papers that I can see the theory contributing to an empirical case and vice versa. Um, yeah, and so that's kind of would be my take on this or my advice from my own personal experience.
Liz, you happen to be next in my Zoom room. Do you mind going next? Sure.
Okay, happy to go next. I'm Liz Clemens. I have done a lot of editing over my career. So I've been on boards at ASR, Contemporary Sociology, among others, and then been an editor or co-editor of both studies in political development and for 6 years at American Journal of Sociology. And I'm currently on the editorial board of the annual review of sociology. So I want to start with, I guess, a sense that yet again we are in another moment of intense transformation and pressure on the system of publishing. There was a webinar for the editors of and editorial boards of all the annual reviews the other day on the implications of AI. And a very talented theoretical physicist at MIT gave the talk that he had asked his AI to write for him. And it was stunningly competent. But it, I think, also clarified what is going to be important to focus on going forward, which is really thinking about the character of the sort of theoretical advance and contribution that can be made in an article form. What was gasp inducing was the level of basic competence at organizing existing knowledge with some hallucinations in there. So, what I thought I'd do is offer a simple trio of the ways in which I have found theoretical contributions to be made, not only in work that I've edited, some that I've written, but a lot that I've read. Because whatever changes about the publishing system, that's where we mere humans are going to continue to have an advantage, if we have any advantage at all. So I want to make a point about sort of conceptual contributions, contributions in terms of establishing a space or dimensions of variation, and then contributions in terms of going from a theoretical claim to claims about what to expect in terms of empirical findings and evidence. So, one kind of important contribution is at the level of conceptual refiguring. And I want to warn here that this isn't simply an issue of coming up with a new label. There's a lot of this in articles that get submitted is, oh, I have a new catchy phrase and I'm going to put it in my title and my abstract. And because it's going to be cited by millions of people, that's going to make my career. A lot of this gets done, very little of it makes career. Instead, really focus on whether you can make a case for some reconceptualization or some renaming to make a difference. Occasionally, and I think it's pretty occasionally, this can be done primarily at the level of conceptual theoretical distinction. And my example here is, an old piece by J.P. Nettle, a political sociologist, who made the argument that rather than thinking about states as a particular kind of organization, it was more productive to think about stateness as a variation, a dimension of variation in the capacity for some kind of collective actor to exhibit agency. That was done primarily as a conceptual discussion. And since I'm talking about a piece published, I think in 1968, possibly 67, in 2026, it was influential. More commonly, and this starts reinforcing some of Gil's points, is these arguments are made in dialogue with empirical research. So here you can start thinking about classics, sort of Granovetter making an argument that ties are not just ties, there are strong and weak ties, and they operate differently. Michael Mann arguing that state power is not just power, but there's despotic power, which is the sort of off with their head kind of power, but also infrastructural power organized through ties with organizations that are not state organizations. Mara Loveman then builds on that by saying, in establishing infrastructural power, we also need to think about symbolic power. And you can practically hear her in a conversation with Charles Tilly, Chuck, you've really got to take ideology and culture, meaning interpretation, more seriously, and making that argument very successfully through an absolutely historically insignificant case. And so if you're wondering about how to make your obscure case theoretically relevant, read Mara Loveman's piece in AJS. So that's a first kind of contribution. A second focuses on typologies and spaces of variation. Mann not only gives us a label, infrastructural power, but he gives us the fetish of sociologists. He gives us a 2x2 table that uses combinations of the two kinds of power to lay out a analytic typology of different forms of state. Loveman does something similar, but rather than a 2x2 table, identifies modes of state expansion. DiMaggio and Powell on the Iron Cage is another example of this, focusing on different modes, channels, mechanisms of organizational conformity. And some of those pieces really have made careers. So not just the renaming, but also doing the work of establishing some kind of space of analytic variation. And then I'd say the last kind of contribution is really working through the empirical or evidentiary implications. So a piece I did with Mark Schneiberg that came out in Sociological Theory does this by taking that DiMaggio and Powell triad of modes of isomorphism and then sort of thinking through what are the empirical and evidentiary implications. Where would you be able to document that? And we did that, we thought, very cleverly by cross-cutting Dick Scott, the organizational theorist, with James C. Scott, the great political anthropologist. So that extension from the theoretical contribution to thinking about its empirical implications. And these, in, I think, successful papers, bring together multiples of these. So I'll just end by pointing to a very recent paper by Heba Alex, a student at Chicago in sociological theory, Fuzzy Boundaries, a mechanism for group accumulation of advantage. She's very interested in licensure and the way in which occupations are determined. And she would come to her committee, which was not just me, but also John Levy Martin and others, and talk about her project. And we would say, oh, that's social closure. We know that's social closure. We know that you're supposed to focus on boundaries and exclusion. She would just like push back. It's like, no, committee. The empirics tell us something very different. And what she was able to do with this piece grounded in empirical analysis was to push back on a dominant way of thinking about occupational boundaries, to demonstrate the ways in which licensure and other occupational restrictions operate to generate advantage within occupations. So, conceptual reframing, spaces of variation, and empirical implications.
Great, thank you so much. Monica, do you mind going next?
Sure, thank you. I will just keep this brief. I'm also on the board of Theory and Social Inquiry. Um, for some of you who are a little younger, who may not have heard what happened, there was a mainstream journal in sociology that a couple of years ago was subject to a hostile takeover by the corporate publisher. So Gail and I and some others were on the board of it. We were forced to resign. We were collectively outraged. We thought, who is this corporation to be telling us what sociology is, right? And so one lesson I took away from that is if you want to get tenured professors to do a lot of free labor for you, get them outraged about something. So since then, we've all collectively, in this bit of peak, put together this whole new journal, Theory and Social Inquiry. I just wanted to make two comments. One is, so one of the things that people were saying back then during those debates about the old theory in society that was correct was that it did take too long to review papers. We have worked very, very hard to get review times down, and we've been very successful at it. Our average review time was 11 and a half weeks. And the top review time was about 22 weeks. So, some articles do go long because, I don't know, things happen. Reviewers are middle-aged people who have lots of obligations, but we're working very hard to keep the review times within reason. And you can usually count on a review within about 3 months. DAS rejects are much, much faster. We're managing those in about 2 weeks. So that problem seems to have been addressed. The other thing I wanted to say is I want to normalize the idea, the experience of getting your article rejected. So this is something that it's just mind blowing to see it from this side. Everyone gets rejections. Tenured professors get rejections, full professors get rejections, famous professors get rejections. It just happens to everyone. Charles Tilly once told me that he had a drawer full of papers that he had not managed to publish, which is a thought that I think of often and that consoles me when my papers get rejected. So, it doesn't sound, we don't necessarily think of sociology as a creative field, but it is a creative enterprise, right? And just kind of stumbling your way forward is just part of what happens. It doesn't feel great, but it's also not an indication that you're not a scholar or, that you can't make a living in this field. So I'll just stop there. Basically, my message is submit to Theory and Social Inquiry and don't get upset if your article gets rejected.
Yes, I have many papers rejected. I think 15 is my current maximum to publication. Gaston, can you go next?
Sure. Thank you so much, Rebecca. Thank you for this, and I'll try to keep it short. So basically, I'm on 7 editorial boards, but the one that matters for this is Theory. And kudos to all the great work you're doing, Omar and co. And I also am here because I'm a co-editor for a new series that just came out last year called Theorizing from Within. It's a sociological series. We had ASA presidents actually endorse it, so that's how it came to be. And I just want to talk about gatekeeping because theory is the places where the most gatekeeping happens. And my co-editor and I, Victoria Reyes, came up with this idea because we feel that it's been years now we're talking about from Alden Morris's taking up the Du Boisian challenge, and we feel we continue not doing that. And if we really want to honor Du Bois and Anna Julia Cooper and Ida B. Wells, what means empirical needs to change, but we're still stuck by deciding what empirical and theory is. For us, the body is empirical work. What everybody calls me search, which still continues because it targets women of color, predominantly queer folks, is not me search for us. This is empirical research. And because we theorize about class, race, and gender, we remain in the ivory tower. But what happens when we actually theorize class as lived experience of our own? That's kind of what we are trying to do. And we pay heed. Our series really uh, exciting, actually. We just got our first two books contracts in less than 7 months for the series being out. So that's really exciting. And it's really for junior scholars. And we're hoping senior scholars might start thinking alongside the boys and others who have told us that the body matters and that theorizing from within matters. And we're not neutral subjects. So that's what we really lean on. And another thing we try to do, and I hope students listening here, I'm an associate professor, been tenured for 6 years, but I'm still young in the profession, if you might say that. But those of us who are pushing back, we won't get published. To be very honest, I'm unable to publish in sociological theory journals because they send them back saying this is not theory as sociology says it is.
No, the poll's only open.
Sorry. So basically, interdisciplinarity matters. I published a book on fractal Orientalism, a whole theory that, again, sociologists don't engage with. It's others, geographers, and other people. So I would encourage junior scholars to think about how they can use other disciplines to theorize, because I was able to bring math and physics to the concept of Orientalism. So that's kind of was really exciting for us. And another thing I'll say, if I have a minute or two left, is again, we are stuck in a place where we just talk about positionality, but what our series does is positionality is only the beginning. And it doesn't mean that the whole book. So we encourage people to submit comparative historical work, interview, ethnography. So Rebecca, thank you for inviting us because we wouldn't have a space otherwise because people don't take it seriously. So I really appreciate you for that. Where we really take the body seriously, but you can thread it throughout as you theorize. And I remember submitting papers for theory journals, especially US, because UK theory journals take papers because they're more cultural studies oriented, whereas here we're stuck with a positivist ideal that we're not willing to move in, especially at elite institutions. So what I encourage people is to take more risks and to stop with the elitism because that's not even going to get you anymore. Elite is the old circle of a few people getting jobs because they come from Ivy Leagues is not the case anymore, thankfully. So I would just end with the idea that we're open. It's a series, and really, again, you can combine any method with auto theory, which is not just autoethnography. And the last thing I'll say is really what that helps us do is it becomes more relatable and it's a form of public sociology at the same time. So it's showing that theorizing, we already have it in us. So that's how we think of theory in our piece. And we encourage playfulness and how we think about theory. And hopefully this will get more people, seeing that theory can be done by relying on the body, especially in the times we're living in. Victoria is in the audience, so if I misrepresented our series, please, you can jump in. But thank you so much, Rebecca, and thanks for everybody.
Victoria, you were great. Do you want to add anything or you're good?
I'm good, but thanks.
Elizabeth, can you go next?
Happy to. Thank you for having me on this panel. I will say I am just a little seedling in the discipline. I only defended in May of last year. In fact, Gil was my committee co-chair. And so I guess thank you. I guess I'll talk just very briefly about maybe sort of picking up a little bit on what Ghassan talked about in terms of sort of theorizing from the margins, right? And the importance of interdisciplinarity. So I am in a Black Studies department now. I teach in a Black Studies department now. That's not by accident, right? I think that in terms of the theories that I gravitated towards, right, in addition to obviously like Du Boisian theory, in addition to Patricia Hill Collins and her writing, it was very sort of clear that my work was going to be sort of influenced by a lot of sort of Black studies theories. So thinking about Hartman and the afterlives of slavery, thinking about Mbembe's necropolitics, right? Thinking about even Afro-pessimism, right? And so I sort of operate from a standpoint in which I aim to sort of synthesize more sort of traditional sociological and even anthropological theory. Thinking a lot about Mary Douglas, who plays a really big, has a really center sort of role in sort of my work, right? The sort of theorizing I do around blame and epidemiology and racialized disease, in addition to sort of incorporating those critical scholars from Black studies that I have mentioned. What I find, what I sort of have realized now reflecting back on my time in graduate school was that theory work happens at very different levels. And I think I sort of came to grad school immediately gravitating towards sort of macro theory, but I actually hadn't had a ton of experience with micro theory, right? And this is where folks like Gil come in, because Gil really sort of pushed me to sort of zero in a bit more in terms of my lens of focus, right? And so instead of making really large macro claims, it's like, okay, can you actually sort of develop and execute the sort of the muscle, right? The training, right? And sort of understanding the relationship between theoretical claims and empirical evidence, and how one actually can go about building from maybe a more micro level theoretical claim to a meso level, and ultimately get to that sort of like super macro level. I also think that something that has been very, very important for me in understanding theory, particularly as someone who does more comparative historical work, in addition to sort of like traditional qualitative work, is understanding the method, like the empirical method with which you work, right? That is being crucial to getting a tighter grasp on the sort of theoretical claims that you will end up, producing largely from, whatever empirical work that you do. And so I took a comparative historical methods course at NYU, I think my second year, and it taught me a lot. We dug really deep into Theda Skocpol's work on sort of revolutions and states. And we were able to sort of really understand the method of sort of case selection and analyses, which ultimately shed a lot of light on sort of how she went about sort of crafting her theory, right? Her theoretical contribution within that book. And so even though, I guess the assumption is that theoretical papers, are often just standalone theory papers. And those are great. And I'm working on a couple of them that I'll have hopefully published in Black Studies journals because they sort of lean more towards that direction. But really sort of understanding the sort of empirical method with which you are using, right? And sort of understanding how claims can appear, right, from the data, from the empirical data, how you're supposed to actually set up your empirical question and your data analysis. I think having a really strong grip on that actually helps deepen your understanding of the sort of formulation of your theory, what you want it to do, what problems you want your theory to be able to sort of respond to and address, in addition to who you might be in conversation with, both within the discipline, but also in other disciplines as well. So I'll leave it at that.
Great. Jonah, can you go next?
Sure, happy to. Can people hear me? It says it's been telling me periodically that my connection is unstable. So let me know if I'm cutting out. I could also try to move locations here. But yeah, thank you. Thank you, Rebecca, for inviting me to this. I think so. Yeah, I'm Jonas Stewart Brundage. I guess in terms of institutional relationships to theory, I'm on the theory section council. I've chaired theory section prizes. The only journal I'm currently on the editorial board of is actually ASR, but they send me for I think reasons that are not totally coincidental. I feel like everything they send me is the very theoretical papers they get, some of them. And so I do think in my role there, I've also thought a lot about sort of what makes for a theoretical contribution. I'm also assistant professor, so I wanted to really try to speak mostly just from my own personal experience with trying to get theory work published. Just maybe, especially that's helpful for people around my stage or a little bit, behind me. Interestingly, I didn't really, I think until recently, actually think of myself as someone sort of who does theory. At least I certainly never thought of myself as doing theory that was in any way separate from my empirical work. And I don't necessarily, I'm not trying to make a claim that the best theoretical work is necessarily also empirical. I think the answer to that probably depends. It's almost the opposite, that in my case, I didn't know how to do my empirical work the way I wanted to do it without making it very theoretical in the process. I would say is more what my experience was. I mean, I think this is partly because I myself am a historical sociologist. I think there are things about the subfield of historical sociology, partly maybe arbitrary, I think partly for good reason, that it's often sort of defined itself partly through its theoretical contributions is partly how it's justified its sort of division of labor within sociology. I think historical sociologists tend to be quite self-conscious theoretically when they do empirical work. So that was sort of the experiences that shaped me initially. I think I really saw myself not as doing theory at first, at least, but as sort of doing social explanation, I guess I would say, or socio-historical explanation in my case. And again, I didn't know how to do that without making it pretty theoretically abstract. I think in a few senses, I think I was interested in the way I thought about explanations involved calling upon a set of, I guess I would say, abstractions, causal mechanisms, just sort of claims about structural conditions. Now, nothing necessarily to do with sort of whether these are theoretically generalizable concepts, but that in my own case itself, I was, to get out of a sort of just narrative analysis of my case, I needed to sort of abstract to theory. I think I thought of myself as very much sort of adjudicating between. I was sort of I guess it's an old school approach, but sort of the way I was trained to do historical explanation was to situate it very much in terms of how would X theoretical tradition explain this? How would Y theoretical tradition explain it? So again, it was like explaining an empirical case, but already situated in competing theoretical traditions. That too was sort of my training. I think another point that doesn't get talked about as much, but I think just sort of the interpretive work of actually being able to make a convincing case about my data. I think given that, in my case, I study mostly 18th century Europe, the fact that not only do I have no sort of direct observations of these people, but they've been dead for 200 years, I think this is the sort of theory in the sense of Clifford Geertz's thick description, right? There's theoretical work that into interpreting, I think, that sort of archival data, but I think that goes into all empirical work. I think maybe a merit of historical sociology explicit, avoid that fact that you're making these interpretive leaps, and that's okay. And then I would say, lastly, I do think the sort of generalizability. I never thought of myself as sort of in any way generalizing from 18th century Europe to the present, but because I work on a case that isn't the present day United States, as most sociologists in the United States work on, I always found myself in the position of having to answer that, so why should we care question? and therefore having to sort of explain why sort of what the larger possible universe of cases that my particular case belonged to. And I hear, especially when I talk to grad students now, and I talk to many grad students who do historical work, international work too, right? I mean, I think it's a frustrating thing that those of us who don't work on the present day United States always sort of have to justify ourselves at the level just of why did we even choose this particular case in a way that contemporary US people don't. But I actually think that's work that just like everyone should be doing, and it just makes for rigorous scholarship. So I think the fact that we're forced to do it actually can make our work stronger. And I guess what I'm trying to say for this conversation is that is also theoretical work. Thinking about what are the sort of, again, abstracted out features of my case, that may be shared, those particular features with other possible cases in other places and times, right? What is that but theory? So I feel like that's another way I found myself doing theory from a pretty early stage. I would just say, lastly, as I've as my career has thus far progressed, I have gradually moved more and more into a place where I feel maybe confident enough to sort of self-consciously do something I would call theory. It very much has always sort of been in this running dialogue with my empirical work. Basically, what's happened is, as I wrote empirical papers, I had these sort of, I guess, things I wanted to theorize that were spin-off ideas from the paper that came up in the paper, and it wasn't the main point. So I wrote a paper, that I worked on diplomats, and it was about sort of how I had this idea in passing that sort of diplomats claim to represent a sovereign, but actually they're in some way they performatively enact the sovereign, state or ruler who they claim to represent. That was an idea that came up in my empirical work, and eventually I ended up writing a paper that was a theory building paper just about that idea. More recently, it's still used my own empirical work as an illustrative case. Now, finally, I would say I'm to the point where I'm interested in through that paper, new ideas came up that I wanted to theorize that really are no longer wedded to my empirical work at all. So I would say I'm only finally to the place where I'm interested in doing work that's sort of like theory building work outside of my sort of empirical research agenda, but that's not totally outside, but that's somewhat more disconnected. And that's we'll see how it goes. I mean, I'm only just getting to that place now, I would say. So yeah, that's what I've got.
Thank you. Omar, can you go next?
Sure. Yes. Thanks for inviting me to this. This conversation has been great so far. I'll also try to keep it brief. I'll just say a couple of things. So the first thing, I think Monica mentioned that sociology is kind of like a creative field, or that as a producers we're kind of in the same position as creative producers. I think that that's right, and I think that in many ways that means that if you want to draw some lessons, we can draw from all that we know about production, right? To think through your role as producers of theory, if that's presumably what we're here for, is to give people pointers as to how to make theory. I think that kind of one obvious thing is, of course, that to make something you have to consume the thing, right? So being consumers of theory is probably the primary precondition for being a producer of theory. Right. And I think in many ways, kind of like reading the theory journals, being familiar with the theoretical canon, whatever your favorite one is an important one, because that's essentially how you get a sense of what the conversation has been and where you can contribute. Right. In many ways, Donald Levine had this kind of great image of theory as a long running conversation that began maybe with Aristotle, presumably maybe before that. And in many ways, as a newcomer producer, you're kind of like the awkward kid that shows up at a cocktail party, people already talking, and you have to kind of figure out how to kind of butt into the conversation. Now, most of us sociologists are not selected for our social skills. And so probably we've already kind of experienced something like that. And I think a lot of the mistakes that happens isn't the equivalent of somebody kind of just, butting into a conversation by yelling or just coming in an awkward way. So, kind of thinking through how you slide into a theoretical conversation is super important. But in order for you to do that, you essentially have to kind of accumulate the cultural capital of knowing what people are talking about and what they care about in the first place. And of course, all those things are moving targets in the sense that conversations change, new topics begin, new conversation partners get added, right? But it's how I would think of it, because essentially, every creative producer, except in the most rarefied parts of the artistic field, have to think about audiences. So when you write theory, you have to think of who am I writing this theory for? Once again, if you're a simplest poet version of a theorist and you're writing for maybe an N of 2, that can happen, but you may not want to do that. The same token, if you think that you're writing for everybody, that's also a mistake. No theory work is going to appeal to everybody. So at sociological theory, which I am just finishing my 3-year term as co-editor, and sometimes we just get papers that are just like a theory of everything. This is a theory of the social, a theory of, it's like, what does that even mean? That's not quite what you want. But at the same time, sometimes I've also gotten papers that are about explaining the second chapter of Helmut Rosa's 10th book, and again, that's also a bit narrow, right? So I think that in many ways you want to kind of hit that sweet spot of your theoretical, entering theoretical conversation and producing theory for a coherent audience of people who would be interested in kind of like kind of seeing what you have to say. The other kind of thing that you tend to think of as a cultural producer is the question of genre. I think this has already kind of come up in various ways. My take on this is that Gabby Aben wrote a paper about like meanings of theory. There were 7. There's probably 25 meanings of theory, but the way that I think of those as meanings, and not just lexical meanings of a word, but essentially genres of theory. And people have already kind of made their case for their preferred genres. Gill likes the empirics plus theory version, and Liz talked about various other ones. But the point is that you have to kind of also figure out what genre of theory you want to write on. It's kind of like a style or a particular kind of thing. So some of our best theorists you can see master a particular genre. And once again, that genre doesn't necessarily have to be the paper with empirics. If you think of somebody like Gabby Aben, right? It's just masterful papers. They don't have any data in them. They're mostly papers about conceptual argumentation, closer to what an analytical philosopher would write. Conceptual engineering, that's an underrated service of what theory does, helping people think through the core concepts in a straighter way. When I was a grad student at the University of Arizona in Tucson in the year 2000, Liz Clemens, the first thing that she put in front of us was a paper by Bill Sewell, classic paper on how to think through the concept of structure, which I still assign to this class in my classes to this day. That paper does not have any empirics. It's just purely a paper about argumentation. Yes, of course, empirics are referenced, but the core parts of the paper is about how to think correctly about a concept. That's an underrated genre of theory. The last thing that I will say was another underrated genre of theory has not been mentioned. It's the old genre of theory that John Martin once referred to as theoryology in the thinking through theory. Essentially, the thinking through, essentially the old humanities, the old-fashioned classical theory, taking a great mind and thinking through what that great mind said. That's especially for beginners, is one that I would recommend. Even though it's old-fashioned, people don't like it, etc. I think that that conversation around theorology has been, I think, conflated with the conversation around the canon, because it is all humanities ideas. People, we have to read Talcott Parsons and Karl Marx, etc. I don't care which great mind you pick. For instance, a great mind du jour is people like Du Bois or something like that. I think pick a great mind, because there is no better way to hone your own theoretical chops than to grapple with the people that have that you think have said something important regardless of who they are. And sometimes even now in the year 2025 and 2026, some of the best papers that we publish in sociological theory are papers that do the old-fashioned, let's pit this great thinker Patricia Hill Collins against this other great thinker, and because that sort of thinking through the core concepts and the core ideas is a way of making a contribution. But that, once again, it requires the same thing. In order for you to grapple with a great mind, you have to pretty much read everything that a great mind has written. And for some people who have lived a long time and write a lot, that could be a big challenge, but it could be a worthwhile challenge.
Great. And Simeon, can you go last for us?
Sure. Hello, everybody. I'm Simeon Newman, assistant professor of sociology at the University of Toronto. I'm very glad to join the conversation. I learned a lot from you already, and I'm relieved, I guess, that most of what I had thought to say hasn't been said directly anyways. So Yeah, by way of introduction, I identify as a political and historical sociologist, and with interests in social theory, the philosophy of the social sciences, and political economy. And and then I got hired for a theory job, and I've been thinking quite a lot about, yeah, what that sort of what that implies in teaching theory, and so I think I've I always was attracted to theory and always felt like it was kind of my area. I participated in the theory workshop at Michigan when I did my PhD. I was sort of a stalwart and stuff, but I thought theory, it sounds a bit pretentious, like I'll do my, other stuff, kind of more empirical studies, and then try to derive the theoretical implications. But the more my own research agenda has evolved, the more I find myself sort of gravitating into areas that seem like they're actually more readily identifiable as theory. So, but maybe not in the same way as everybody would define theory. So that's, I guess, a little bit about me, sort of biographical. Yeah, in terms of my comments, I wanted to start by just saying it seems like this is for the sort of new people like me and maybe like earlier, it seems like the journal and kind of professional landscape is a bit grim in the theory area. We have few places to publish contributions that are to theory per se, especially with the coup at Theory and Society. Keep in mind, there's the whole kind of, if we're talking English language, there's the British sphere, which, like most of the sociology journals in Britain, I would say, just lean more toward theory than the American journals. So I wouldn't rule those out, but then they tend to be shorter in length and stuff. So it's yeah, like the publishing landscape looks pretty grim. I'm hopeful that theory and social inquiry continues to sort of or I guess takes up some of that slack, continues to take up some of that slack. Um, so that's on the one hand, the situation looks a bit grim. On the other hand, it seems like there's kind of more need now than ever for theory work, I guess I would say, sort of like proper theory work that really gets into the kind of conceptual mechanics of a specific substantive problem. Um, and and I say this because it seems to me that theory is perhaps the best area for kind of rising above the tussle of empirical disputes to offer something fresh and timely, if not just a little bit different from what we've been hearing. And as the discipline comes under tons of heat and as things are changing so quickly, it seems to me, and then, as the political situation is melting down and as we're wondering if we'll survive nuclear war, et cetera, it seems like there's an opportunity for sociologists to sort of step it up a gear and be a little bit bolder. And I think theory's got to be central to that. Because it gets to sort of fundamentals, and because for that reason, it's, I guess I would say, a little bit more political than other fields of sociology and social inquiry. Right, we're in a politically charged moment, and that's perfect for theory, I think. So there's a major contradiction there. It's terrible prospects for publication, and yet we really need this work. So that's, I think, our kind of situation. So then what is theory? The position I take is actually that it's not just analytically sharp case studies. I view theory as more adjacent to philosophy and essentially as a form of kind of social philosophy. And so I think it's concerned with two main questions: sort of what are the things that we can know, and how can we know the things that we think we can know? So it's adjacent to sort of metaphysics and epistemology, you might say. There's, of course, also the breakdown of classical theory versus contemporary theory, and sort of, the origins and nature of modern society and contemporary society. And I think that's mostly what are the things that we can know. And then, of course, there's epistemic debates that sort of come out of that. But to me, that's really the sort of the area of theory in sociology, sort of speaking to this kind of question. Not that I don't like smart, analytic, empirical papers. I love them. They're sort of my bread and butter, but I don't think that sort of really substitutes for like theory per se. So where does that sort of leave one if they're sort of thinking about, gee, should I be doing sort of theory? I guess I would say I wouldn't limit yourself to empirical questions. Or always think that you have to discuss sort of empirical evidence to derive your conclusions. I think that's the rule of that. If you think that that doesn't fit quite right for you, and you're doing theoretical, and you're in your own work, then maybe think about what you're doing as having a sort of theoretical streak to it, or a specific branch of your research agenda that's kind of theoretical per se. Meanwhile, don't stop your empirical research agenda, because you got to write the empirical dissertation. Pretty much every program says so. Yeah, I would sort of keep that up, but also don't try to put to rest those kind of neat conceptual problems that you discover, like when you're doing your sort of empirical research agenda. And I guess like the way I work is I have lots of sort of ideas in mind, and I end up toggling back and forth. I'm working on an empirical project, and I find a very interesting, like I'm reading in a literature, and I find something that's quite interesting for an adjacent sort of project, and I sort of then toggle and sort of keep multiple projects kind of running parallel to one another. And that to me is a way of getting insights that are not just already freely available within a particular literature, to try to like move a particular topic or debate forward. I find it helps to sort of move laterally like this. And then the last thing I would say is, I guess this is just this is my hope that those who are kind of at my stage and younger hold on to topics that you think are important, even if they're unpopular. I don't, I mean, another sort of twist on Granovetter or something like that is never going to shed very much insight compared to something that you say that might be just completely fresh and sort of out of the blue. And I think the time is right for that. And I think it's sort of incumbent on us, those who get paid to write and to think and to offer ideas, to do sort of more of that. And so, yeah, so those are my thoughts. And thanks very much for including me.
Great, thanks everyone so much. We're gonna do questions, and while you're gathering your questions, I just want to remind you that the ASA memberships have to be renewed by the 31st in order to vote in the elections, and there's a bunch of important things coming up surrounding the election. So please renew your membership, and also please remember to join the theory section. Things like this don't just happen accidentally. They take a lot of labor behind the scenes and a lot of support from the section, etc., and so forth. And that's supported through being a member of the theory section. So if you could join, it's very easy. You just hop on the ASA website and it takes you through that process. So we would really appreciate your supporting the theory section. So we will take questions. Ghassan, you want to start us off?
Oh, I was just going to add something very
Yes,
quickly.
sure.
Sorry, I forgot to add that, and hearing everybody else. And what happens, just to take bolder risks, as Simeon was saying, is to think of theory as method. That's something we encourage in our series, because theory and method, we put them as difference, but some theories, like if I'm thinking here of one of the best sociologists who is forgotten, Rod Ferguson, who wrote Aberrations in Black, who is not taught in theory courses, which I don't understand. He had to learn the classical theories to go against sociology and write a whole book. And Queer of Color Critique, which is born from a sociologist, which again, sociologists don't want to take that seriously, tells us that theory is method. And that's so I encourage you all to just not just rehash the same people, but Rod Ferguson's Aberrations in Black from 2004 does not get taught in theory courses, and that's mind-boggling to me. That's a sociologist. And Theory of Trace by people just because they've left the discipline or were pushed out of the discipline. We should still be reading them and learning from them, but we refuse to, sadly. That's the sorry, Rebecca. Thank you.
That was great. Yes, questions about anything that people have said. Questions about writing, publishing. We have a whole set of experts here. You can ask them anything you want. Jump in.
Hello, how are y'all doing? Do you see me here? I'm Daryl. I just graduated from National University. My name is Daryl Scott, PhD in Business Administration. However, during that process, I did my dissertation on veterans, disabled veterans, the LMX theory, that type thing. Then I end up finding out the harm that veterans go through, and I came upon discovering a theory that I call the civilization interaction theory. And I've written it up, and it has 5 domains: political, economic, the basic 5 domains. And I want to know, how would I bring this theory forward? I submitted to ASA, APA, and then CBIAC to try to get a poster done and try to get on board. But what would be the best way to enter the canon, you would say, or enter the talk? I think one of you talked about being mature enough to enter the conversation. It's already onboarding, but teach me, show me. Anyone can dive in and kind of help me out. How can I onboard this theory?
Yeah, can one of our participants or several of our participants help out here?
So, Daryl, I'll just repeat the wise words that Omar gave, which is, if you want to enter a conversation, you've got to make sure you know that conversation. So, first, make sure that you have read everything from the journal that you're trying to publish in, and think about what they are saying that is relevant to what you are trying to do. And if they're not saying anything that is relevant to what you're trying to do, then that's not the journal for you. So find, in addition to just kind of entering the conversation, find the conversation that is relevant to you.
What I did specifically, I came up about 5 domains: political domain, economic domain, institutional domain, moral symbolic domain, and cultural psychology domain, which are the minimum domains in which to approach civilization and identify harm. And what you're talking about, I started with WST, World Systems Theory, Wallerstein, and then I moved on to well, before that it was Brodel, the French theorist about longevity, history, long time. And I put all this together to come up with a methodology to use interaction as the mode of inquiry to identify harm. And when I say identify harm, why harm persists when we see it and nothing changed? That's how I came about this through my travels. I'm ex-military, so I've traveled, been in Iraq, I've been in East, my first unit was on the East-West German border. So I've seen the world, and I went to Middle East, Dubai, and I went over to Africa, and I seen the whole world. And that's how this theory came. It's kind of like a live position. So you're right. I guess be a big boy. Just jump right in.
Well, I think your strategy is good to try a couple conferences. And so, usually at the conferences, there's a discussant, and that'll give you some ideas about how people are reading your paper and, give you some ideas for revisions. So that's a really good idea to start there and try to send it to someplace where they do have a discussant. And then, you need to everybody needs to cultivate a few set of good readers where you read their paper and they read your paper. So you get, some sense. And then, and then start with the journals and, pick a journal where stuff looks like what you have. And then really you just have to keep sending it to journals. And more and more journals now do desk rejects, which is unfortunate for authors without a lot of experience. But just keep sending it around, and you get reviews, and you look at the reviews, and you're like, okay, like how do I revise it? So it's very incremental. Getting comments back and revising and those sorts of things. Monica, did you want to?
Rebecca, yeah, I just wanted to follow up with one thing. So Theory and Social Inquiry is a good journal to submit to right now if you're in that position, because we are not up to the number of submissions that we had before the coup. And so one thing that allows us to do is we are doing substantive desk rejects. So when we send a desk reject, we write sometimes a very detailed letter, which is basically a review from one person explaining what we think, why we weren't convinced by this, what you might have to do, where else you might publish it. I don't know if that is something that we'll be able to continue doing as submissions ramp up, but it is something that we're doing right now.
If I could just jump in, Omar made this point about the dangers of trying to write a paper that's about everything, a theory of society. And so, Daryl, one thing you might do is think about who is going to be directly interested in one piece of this project and making that the sort of entering frame. And what I hear you saying is that this is a different way of thinking about harm. So you might switch the project rather than presenting it as a sort of grand theory that is based on a very specific case. Start with the idea of harm. There are particular audiences who are interested in theorizing harm, and then make an argument to them about how this case and this combination of theoretical resources leads you to a different way of thinking about harm, and what I take from you is a different way of thinking about remedy.
Saida, do you have a question?
Yes, thank you, Rebecca. And hi. And thank you very much for this panel. It was really useful. My name is Sayeda. I'm an assistant professor in sociology. My question is about grounded theory. So I'm curious about how grounded theory as a mode of theorizing is helpful alongside historically grounded approaches. So if we take seriously the idea that method is itself a form of theory, as Ghassan points out, what do you think is the role of grounded theory in the current sociological theory milieu?
Does anyone want to bite on that? Well, people are thinking, well, I can give my 2 cents. I mean, I think it's fallen out of favor a little bit in general. I mean, this may be a little bit influenced by the fact that I've been at UCLA so long, but for sure the ethnography classes were all taught in terms of grounded theory when I first came, and they're no longer taught in that way. I mean, I think there's been a general philosophical recognition that you cannot come to a theoretical conclusion through pure induction, and so there's been a huge shift towards using deduction or abduction, retroduction, or iterative deduction and induction. But the idea that you could just sort of go around, look at things, and develop a theory from that, I think has sort of fallen out of favor. So I would say off the top of my head, there's been a shift towards looking in some way at theories that have more deduction in them. But that's probably, but it's probably not universally true. I think the other influence just comes from substantive theory, where there's just a lot more emphasis on positionality, and everybody starts from some sort of position. And Ghassan talked about how actually that's really insufficient. Also from that substantive point of view, I think there's just a stronger recognition that you can't really go into a field, without some sort of preconception of that. So that would be sort of the take off the top of my head about that. Do other people want to jump in? Jonah?
I'd say, I mean, the things Rebecca, if you're interested in grounded theory as a starting point, I mean, I think for me, the thing, others may actually disagree, I don't know, including people at UCLA, but the abduction thing in particular. So if you look at, I don't know if you've looked at that, Stefan Timmermans and Ido Tavore's work on abduction, abductive analysis. For me, this is where, I don't know, my read at least, is that is in some ways, particularly for ethnographers, an attempt to salvage something more similar to grounded theory, while obviously acknowledging this fact that Rebecca's pointing out, that it would be very naive to talk about observations or facts as if they weren't already in some way theory laden. I think it totally takes that on board, but it's still, I read it as still attempting to salvage a more sort of bottom-up version. It's actually not the kind of work I do, but I think it's very useful.
Nita, you had your hand up earlier. Did you still want to ask a question?
Yeah, sure. Thank you everyone for your insights on rank theory. I really appreciate that, a number of speakers have talked about or encouraged interdisciplinary thinking. And I'm in the sociology department at UCLA, but I also engage with the interdisciplinary field of Asian studies, where sociology is actually very much a rarity. And so my question, I guess, to anyone who wants to answer it is, when do you decide to bring an interdisciplinary perspective into sociology and aim for like a sociology journal versus bringing your specific disciplinary expertise as a sociologist into an interdisciplinary field?
Monica or Liz, you've edited a lot of soc journals. What can I ask you to put in your 2 cents here?
I have to admit that when students ask me this question, I'm always very, very utilitarian. I tell them if you're looking for a job, what are the job committees going to look for? You're looking for tenure, what are the tenure committees going to look for, right? So aim for that. I guess you wouldn't be asking this question if you really had a journal that you loved. Obviously, if you have a journal that you love, then that's the answer, right? Submit to that journal. But if not, then I would say, think about what is it that you want this article to do? Is it that you want a certain audience to read it? So for example, you might have a political issue that you're really interested in. And so you might want people of that, people who work on that issue to read. If you're a sociologist in development, for example, there are a certain set of journals that you want people to read. So if you don't have any sort of, I guess, substantive commitments of that nature, then I would say go the utilitarian route, to do the journals that are going to be most respected by the kinds of jobs that you want to get.
I'll just add, a personal preference is to think about multidisciplinarity as opposed to interdisciplinarity. It's hard. You have to be a master of very different expectations about method, evidence, and argument. So I think Monica just said the key word, and Omar made the argument earlier. It's audience. Part of the choice is which parts of your project are going to be compelling to the audience that is organized to use older language around an area studies model, and which pieces of it are going to be of interest to sociologists. And again, I would point to Mara Loveman's AJS on symbolic power, where she makes an utterly obscure episode in Brazilian political history that isn't really even of interest to Brazilian historians, or wasn't. And she uses that to make a really powerful argument to an audience of political and historical sociologists. And she wasn't Mara Loveman at the time she did it. I cited a lot of classic articles, but they were all really pretty much published when their authors were early in the discipline. So you can take those daring moves, but think about who's going to want to listen to it. Who needs, or even more strongly, who needs to hear it, even if they aren't already inclined to listen?
Yubin, do you have a question?
Yes, thank you so much for this beautiful presentation. I wanted to ask about so we do kind of assume that, or like have a fantasy that we're doing, knowledge for knowledge's sake, but we're also a collective enterprise that's responding to the times. And I'm wondering about kind of theoretical positions that complement what we're living through today. It's very chaotic and turbulent. As leading voices in sociological theory and as editors of the journals that shape our thought, I'm wondering what types of thought you think fits best to explain some of the currents that are happening, as well as what you think are certain agenda setting perspectives. I think this would be very diverse, and there's no one leading voice, but I was just curious about the room. Also, as editor of the newsletter, I'm always kind of thinking back to sociological theory to make sense of everything that's happening. So, yeah, if there's any thoughts on that, thank you.
Well, maybe this is just a personal reflection, but I've gotten really interested in, let me take one step back. First of all, I completely agree with Simeon, who, commented that, we really, in a crisis, we really need theory. We need new theory and new ways of thinking about things. We, in some sense, we know the awful things that are going on, and we need to ask different questions, different theoretical questions to get new perspectives on it. So I totally agree with Simeon, that we need more theory right now. And then I guess just a personal note, maybe it's just an example, or maybe it's not useful, but I've become really interested in the sociology of unknowing. I mean, we have a very well-developed sociology of knowing, from Mannheim, Marx, Berger and Luckmann, Foucault, but it's all rooted in this Enlightenment tradition of, a particular way of in positivism of pairing theory and evidence. And of course, as colonialism spread, it wiped out all other sorts of ways, or deprivileged all other sorts of ways of linking evidence and theory. And with all the erasures of knowledge, the taking down of the government websites and the refusal to investigate thing, it's really important to know about not knowing, and we just don't have a well-developed a set of theories of unknowing because of this sort of privilege of the Enlightenment thought. So that's one thing that I've just gotten really interested in, is sort of thinking of typologies of unknowing and sort of developing a sociology of unknowing along with a sociology of knowing. So maybe that's a personalistic example, but that's definitely one way in which my thinking has really been influenced, and it brings up a lot of things that Ghassan was talking about earlier, about how different bodies of thought have been deprivileged or sort of relegated to the we don't need to know about that category, and those really contain a lot of insight. So I don't know if that's helpful or not, but that's sort of what I've been thinking about. Simeon, I called you out, and also your hand is up.
Can you hear me okay? Oh, great. Yeah, well, you've been obviously I'm interested in the question, so I figured I'd chime in. I mean, it seems like one observation that's relevant here is like the sort of comparison to sort of a couple, I guess, comparisons, maybe one to the sort of the 1960s, if you will, where like Parsons is out and Marx is in, like the canon gets changed to respond to social crises, right? Depending on what kind of conceptual tools we feel we need, this sort of thing. And I think, we're probably living through a crisis that's at least as deep. And it seems to me that the sort of like implications of that for theory are still to be determined. It's like the iron is really hot right now. I did a postdoc at University Tate Heidelberg at the Max Weber Institute for Soziologie, which is the place that Max Weber taught, and Zimmel and Lukács was there a bunch. Like it's this sort of classic place where all these theorists were hanging out in Germany in the last century. And I learned that they didn't have a single course on Nazism. So here's two extremes for you, like the US in the 1960s, basically trying to rethink its thinking in light of a crisis. And then another case of like refusal to kind of think about what's even happening. And there's sort of obviously historically specific reasons for that. But like, I guess what I'm trying to say is it can go either way, right? We could either rise to the occasion or we could not. There's downstream implications of what happens to German sociology. I mean, in some sense, that's how we got here in North America or whatever. But I guess the point I was trying to make is that it seems like it's sort of up to us. I mean, it's also up to the journals and the book series and stuff like that, the degree to which they're going to sort of be receptive to things that start new conversations that make relatively major deviations from existing conversations, right? That, to use Omar's language of before, are more awkward when slipping into a conversation than might have been the case, 10 years ago or something like that. So I guess there's a question of whether the authors want to write, whether the editors want to sort of say, yeah, I see these criticisms from reviewers, but this piece is doing something I haven't seen done before, and that might have value. Yeah, I mean, I guess the last bit, this is just actually a little plug for Rebecca. Some of the other work that Rebecca has done in her critical studies and as critical theory and practice stuff is that I think there's still this kind of panel coming up, I think maybe at least on kind of new forms of imperialism, something like that, to sort of rethink how Trumpism marks a sort of new era in, kind of world system, in, geopolitics, in national politics in the US, in international relations between countries. I don't know exactly, but that I'm excited to see that, assuming it's coming, then I think that will be also a place to really start to continue to think this kind of a problem. Thanks for the question.
If I could just jump in on that, I also wanted to talk about this issue of responding to crisis. So we have a little community going around what we call problem-solving sociology. It's actually a pretty big community at this point. It's like over 600 people. This is problem solving is basically a descendant of pragmatism. The 19th century pragmatists argued that the way to learn about the social world was through trying to solve specific problems. And so this approach tries to instantiate what would that actually look like. Problem solving in sociology, the difficulty is that we don't actually know what a problem is, and we don't actually know what solving is, right? So we talk about how do you think through these things. So I put the website in chat here, and I'll just mention just before I got on this panel, I opened my email and learned that we are going to be able to do a problem solving sociology series with Cambridge University Press. So this relates to Simeon's question about whether editors and presses will be open to scholarship that actually takes on the big questions. So.
There's also a question in the chat. Chuyu, are you still here? Do you want to call it out yourself? You are still here. Do you want to? The question is, chat, for those of us who find theory quite difficult to approach at first, especially in terms of whether we read it correctly, how would you suggest approaching theory as something to work with rather than something you should make it completely right? I know we're losing panelists here, but does anybody want to say something about that? Cody, do you want to toss in another question while maybe people are collecting their thoughts on that?
Sure. Hold on, I'm not used to Zoom anymore. I have to lower my hand. I'm also a baby scholar, so I'm just excited to have a depth of knowledge and experience just splayed out in the digital world. One of the things in my department that I often struggled with, and I'm curious if this is just anecdotal to me and the culture I was nested within, or if y'all are seeing this in a more broad sense, is I saw a great deal of conflation of what theory is. And in particular, I have, in my mind, a very differentiating line between a formal theory and an applied theory. And I found that many people leveraged formal theoretical models in an applied sense, but then treated the applied theory as the subsequent theory to induce and generalize out, which struck me as logically inconsistent. So for instance, I found people who had very, very specialized and impressive studies on, for instance, the application of colonialism or the application of financial power, but they didn't recognize they were actually implementing formal theories of oppression or what am I trying to say? Formal theories of domination as they relate across time and space. They were trying to take something that is couched in a specific moment and expand it out versus kind of substantiating this broader claim. And maybe I'm wildly off base. I'm happy to hear pushback if I'm incorrect, but I'm just curious if that's something y'all seen or if I'm just a paranoid sociologist who's scared everything is collapsing.
I have sort of a thought, which is I would use it sort of, I think I get what you're getting at. I would think of it more on a continuum, though. I mean, I think the way I would think about it is that theories have scope conditions.
Mm-hmm. Yes, exactly.
I at least think in the, I mean, I don't know, like, I don't know anything about physics really, but in the social world, I think most of our theories, and I think probably I would be suspicious of a theory actually that didn't have some scope conditions attached to it, sort of beyond which, the expectations of the theory don't actually pass. And so because the world changes, right? And there's
my hope is if I ever develop a theory that it dies in 50 years because we advance science and found out Cody was wrong about that.
Because the world itself has changed such to render. I mean, I mean, Marxism means a lot of different things to different people, but the thing that I think is most compelling about Marxism is it's a theory that is sort of, in some sense, politically designed to render itself obsolete, right?
Yes.
But I guess all that is to say that I think, I don't know. I mean, I think I don't think I wouldn't say that there's some realm of formal theories that then get applied. I would say different theories have sort of different sort of scopes. And I think what's important, is to be self-conscious about what you think the scope conditions of your theory are. But I don't think, I mean, I think a theory could be quite narrow in its scope conditions and still be powerful. Again,
Without a doubt.
it's never going to be coterminous with the.
No.
It wouldn't make sense to talk about a theory that was, I guess, coterminous with your piece of evidence or your case itself. But I don't think they need to be. I think just being self-conscious about scope conditions, I guess, is what I'm getting at.
Well, and what I truthfully, some of what I heard, whether intentional or otherwise, from the panelists and this discussion has been, there's really been an implicit discussion about always returning to the, like you're saying, these abstract scope conditions, the context of what you're trying to study, and making sure that the data you're using, the methodology you're employing, the analysis you're subsequently conducting fit within this broader scope condition and theoretical frame.
I guess, yeah, just to give an example, I would be skeptical of a theory of colonialism, of modern colonialism, that actually was also a theory of like empires of the ancient world. I would actually be skeptical. That would sound, I mean,
and that's truthfully actually a really
like,
acute example of what I experienced in my department was that exact thing where we took very specific case studies and then backpedaled into, and this applies back to history. And I go, well, no, I don't, maybe, but that's not what this discussion actually was. Anyhow, I'm rambling. The human thing, if anyone has a moment, is when you get rejected as someone desperately trying to get published, what are just some human things y'all have found to soothe yourself, calm down? Like, is it have a good meal? Is it take a walk? Is it touch some grass? And that's a side thing. We can discuss more serious things, but that is something I'm curious on.
I mean, I actually think that's very serious, and people have really different coping strategies. I mean, I have a colleague where, the first thing they do is, write a hate letter, but then rip it up, right? Right? You can stab it with a knife or put it through your letter shredder or whatever. But yeah, people do all sorts of things, self-soothing, take a break. I mean, you first of all really shouldn't do anything about the rejection itself until you have some space from it. You can't. You do have to actually get over the freak out before you can deal with it on a substantive level. So I don't think it's at all silly. You're just going to get, not you personally, we are all going to get hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of these rejections. So you do have to have a really personal coping strategy for it, because you're just going to get a lot. And students tell me, well, I got rejected 3 times. I guess this is just never going to get published. No. You just send it back. You have to look at what the reviewers say and see what's sensible and what's just they're just doing crazy stuff, and then, and revise, and you just keep going. I mean, Monica had to leave. I guess I'm more, I didn't realize this, but I guess I'm more of an idealist. I really think, if it's multidisciplinary, it's multidisciplinary. If I'm bringing in ideas from somebody, not sociology, then that's what I'm doing. If I want to work on, the 15th century, then I work on the 15th century. I'm really, I guess I'm much more of an idealist, but then I'm just very stubborn. This is what I want to do. This is my idea, and I'm going to publish it. And, maybe, I don't know, maybe that's not a very good career strategy, but it's an authentic one. So, I'm just always working who would be my audience? How am I going to pitch this? How am I going to make it better? How am I going to get people interested in this time and place? How am I going to bring these disciplines in, and that sort of thing? And then I also just wanted to address to you a question in the chat. So one year I was just like, I'm done teaching a canon. I'm never teaching a canon again. So what I did was we picked I picked sections of Marx and Weber. And then I found Johanna Hernandez Perez, one of my students helped me, and we found for each sort of little section of Marx and Weber, we found a contemporary piece that expanded it in some way. And so we read the classic little section, and then we read these, things that had drawn on it or critiqued it or whatever. And then we voted what we were going to do with the classic section, whether we were going to keep reject or revise. And we had funner categories like, cancel was one of them or something. And it was just great. It was the funnest part of class. And we went around, cancel, but, keep it, revise. But maybe it's answering a little bit of Chu's question, which is that, there's always there's something about it that is worthwhile, but then there's also something about it that we want to revise, and that may change over time. And so, I think that's always important to keep in mind. There was one more question. I'm sorry. The person lowered their hand and now I can't remember who it is. If there's one more question still from somebody, we can take that. Otherwise, it is 12:30, so it might be a good time to say goodbye. Yeah, Yu Chen.
Hi, thanks for sharing all these insight. I do have a question about publication, since a number of panelists mentioned the opportunities for publishing theory is pretty slim, especially for those papers that are kind of theory for theory's sake, or to borrow Omar's words, that are more about how to think about the concept. So what kind of advice would you give for those of us who are interested in writing these kind of papers?
Oh, you just have to make a list of journals that publish that sort of thing, and just send them around. Just get really stubborn and just keep sending them around. I have a paper now which is in this weird liminal space where the theory journals say that it's an empirical paper and the empirical papers say that it's a theory paper. What is going on? What is going on? So I think it's a theory paper. So I just have a list of journals, and you just get stubborn and send it around. I don't know. Other people are maybe more prosaic than I am, but I just get really stubborn. Simeon, do you want the last word here? Jonah, it looked like you were going to say something too.
I hope it's not the last.
Let Simeon take it.
I hope it's not the last word. So please pipe in, Jonah. I guess, especially, all the powerful people are gone now, so we can get real. Look, the publishing is not a meritocracy. There's all these networks that are at play. There's all this branding stuff. So if you can avail yourself of in my area, path dependency. Oh my God, if you can lay claim to that, then suddenly there are 25 reviewers who are automatically eligible, and they will be interested in seeing that kind of work develop, their particular area. So if you can sort of lay claim to that brand and sort of advance it by one increment, there's this whole nepotistic kind of a game type thing. So that's the reality of it. And you can use that information to your advantage in the sense that you can try to pull together your own network to a certain extent. And so I would think about, enlisting people in conversations, organizing panels like SSHA. If you're a kind of historical type person, SSHA is a great place for this, to sort of get people into the same conversation. And then those people are sometimes tapped directly for your to serve as reviewers, right? And if they like the kind of intellectual project you have at play, then that might go well for you. And then of course, just the more pedestrian side of this is of course, cite the people who you think would be sympathetic to the intellectual project somehow in a way that's easy to find in the paper for an editor to sort of say, oh, okay, you're talking to this person who's currently writing, currently active and whatever. And so that they can, solicit a review from that person. So, I mean, in other words, you have to kind of game the system, that's what I would say, try to do that. And then also, I mean, lastly, this is, this isn't really career advice, but this is, I think, intellectual advice. Publish what you want to publish. Don't, this is my thing. I knew, my most recent publication was something that I've tried to publish for a very long time. And I knew the style of writing I wanted to do. I wanted to write an essay and not a kind of analytic, American style journal article. And I knew I wanted to write a long thing that cited a million different works, because that was the piece that I wanted to put out. And so it took me a while to sort of figure out the kind of journal that would be receptive to that sort of thing. And it's not in it's not a prestigious journal, but it's fine. It's available. It's and it enables me to say sort of what I want to say. So, I mean, that's not the kind of thing that will get you a job talk or whatever. But there's different parts of the intellectual agenda, right? Ones that will pop out on your CV, and then ones that will allow you to do the work that you want to do to kind of keep your thing moving forward. And they're not always the same.
Yeah, another good space, I just put a link in the chat. Join us in the Global Critical Studies and Praxis Network. We're doing lots of, Simeon called out to this earlier, we're doing lots of really interesting talks, and they're on Zoom, and we're sort of combining Global North and Global South, and you can just sign up beyond the website is here. You can sign up, and I'm open to people organizing talks. If people want to do a theory talk, that'd be great. Something that sounds like people are interested in is sort of theorizing in the crisis space or something like that. So join up there, and it's another good space. Okay, we are at 12:36. We're losing people, so I think we should sign off there. Thank you everybody so much. Big round of applause. I think this was great. And some people left emails and stuff in the chat, so I'll give everybody just a minute here to scroll through while everyone signs off. Bye. Thank you.
Thank you. Bye.
Bye.
Thanks, Rebecca.
You're welcome.